She was 10 years old when the world asked her to become a wife. But before that day, she was just a child chasing goats through dust and sunlight, barefoot, curious, unafraid. Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight in our figures story, we step into the life of a girl who stood before a judge and changed the course of history, not by shouting, but by simply saying no. In tonight's story, we explore courage born from innocence, the kind that burns quietly until the whole world feels its warmth. When a 10-year-old Yemeni girl walked into a courthouse alone, no one imagined she was about to rewrite her nation's laws or awaken its conscience. The morning the men arrived, Sana'a was already heavy with heat. Nujood's house, 2 small rooms of cracked plaster and fading blue doors, stood on the edge of the city like a forgotten secret. Chickens pecked at the dust. A kettle hissed somewhere inside. Her mother, Shoya, wrapped a scarf tightly around her face, avoiding eye contact with the visitors. Her father, Ali, leaned on the doorway, his weathered hands trembling, not from age, but from defeat. Unemployment had emptied his pride long before it emptied his pockets. Nujood stood behind her mother, small enough to hide behind the folds of her dress. The men spoke in low voices, the rhythm of bargaining, a promise, a bride price. She didn't understand every word, but she recognized the tone. It was the tone grown-ups used when they traded goats or furniture or land. Her name was being traded that morning. In Yemen's countryside, childhood and womanhood were often divided by a single decision, made not by the girl herself, but by the elders who believed they were saving her from hunger, gossip, or worse. Ali thought he was rescuing his daughter from poverty. In truth, he was selling her childhood to survive 1 more month. When the agreement was made, the men sealed it with tea and a prayer. The groom was in his 30s. Nujood had not yet lost her baby teeth. That night, she cried quietly into her blanket, listening to her mother's whispers through the wall. Pleas to reconsider, promises to protect. But no mother's plea could undo what poverty had already arranged. The wedding would happen in 2 days. The courtyard filled with borrowed laughter, incense, and ululations that sounded like celebration but felt like betrayal. Nujood's hands were painted with henna she didn't ask for. Her dress smelled of jasmine and fear. When they placed a veil over her face, the world turned orange and distant. She couldn't see her mother anymore, only shapes, blurred like memories. Someone whispered, "Smile, little one." But she couldn't. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she had been taught that silence was safety and obedience was love. That night, the journey to her husband's mountain village began. The road was long, the car cold, the silence heavier than the hills that surrounded them. Her husband, she still couldn't bring herself to use the word, spoke only once, to tell her she would now be his responsibility. Responsibility. The word echoed like a warning. Days turned into weeks of confusion and terror. She wasn't a wife. She was a prisoner of tradition. Her small hands washed dishes too large for her frame. Her nights were filled with the sound of footsteps approaching the door she wished would stay closed. Sometimes she thought of her mother's face, half hidden behind a scarf, and wondered, did she know what would happen? Sometimes she thought of school, of her notebooks left behind, and imagined the smell of chalk as freedom. But mostly she thought of running. One morning, after another night of tears and threats, the chance appeared like a miracle disguised as routine. Her husband left for the market. The house was silent. She stepped outside. The air was sharp with dust. She didn't look back. For hours, she walked, 10 years old, a child in sandals too big, walking toward a city she barely remembered. She followed the main road until her feet bled and her courage stopped hurting. No one asked her name. No one stopped her. Maybe they didn't see her. Or maybe they knew she was on a mission larger than herself. By sunset, she reached Sana'a. The call to prayer echoed across the rooftops, but her prayer was simpler. Help me find someone who will listen. When she saw the courthouse, she thought it looked like a school. Wide steps, big doors, and people carrying papers instead of books. Maybe, she thought, someone here will know how to make things right. Inside, the guards stared. A small girl alone, dusty, trembling. Where is your family? One asked. She swallowed hard. I came to get a divorce. For a moment, silence covered the room like a blanket. Then laughter, nervous, awkward, unbelieving. But she stood her ground. I want a divorce. The guard didn't know what to do. No one had ever heard a child say those words before. He led her to a judge, and that judge would soon realize that history had just walked into his courtroom, wearing torn sandals. The courtroom was colder than she expected. Dust floated in sunbeams, slicing through high windows, and every echo of footsteps seemed to carry judgment. Nujood had never been inside such a place. The marble floor, the wooden benches, the men in robes, they all belonged to another world. Judge Abdul Rahman Al-Ahdal looked up from a stack of papers and froze. Before him stood a girl who barely reached the table's edge. Her scarf was crooked, her cheeks streaked with dirt, and her eyes, wide, steady, and much older than 10, met his without fear. He asked softly, "What brings you here, child?" Her answer was clear. "I want a divorce." He blinked. "From whom?" "My husband." The word husband fell heavy between them. It seemed impossible, absurd, and yet she said it with a certainty that made it true. The judge gestured for her to sit. "Where are your parents?" "I ran away." He exchanged glances with his clerk. There were rules, forms, hierarchies, but none fit the situation before him. For the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of the law bending under the small feet of a child. Outside, a lawyer named Shada Nasser was finishing a hearing in the next chamber. She was one of the few women in the entire courthouse. Sharp-voiced, determined, known for defending those who couldn't defend themselves. When she heard whispers about a little girl asking for a divorce, curiosity pulled her in. She entered the judge's office and found Nujood sitting on a bench, holding her knees close to her chest. "Who is this?" she asked. The judge sighed. A child with a case the law was never written to handle. Shada knelt beside the girl. "What's your name?" "Nujood Ali." "How old are you?" 10. Shada's heart sank. "And you're married?" Nujood nodded. "He hurts me." Every night. That last sentence silenced the room. Shada asked permission to take her home for safety. The judge agreed, but warned that the husband might come looking. On the way to her car, Shada noticed how Nujood held the seatbelt strap like a lifeline. "Do you want to go back to school?" she asked gently. Nujood looked out the window. "I just want to sleep without being afraid." News of the case spread quickly through the courthouse, then the city, then the country. Some laughed it off, a publicity stunt. Others were furious, a shame to tradition. But among women, teachers, and silent daughters, something stirred. If she could speak, maybe we could too. Shada prepared the petition with trembling hands. There were no precedents. No paragraph of Yemeni law said a 10-year-old could divorce. But nowhere did it say she couldn't. When the first hearing opened, journalists packed the hallway. Cameras weren't allowed, yet flashes of curiosity lit the air. Shada whispered to Nujood, "Tell the truth and don't be afraid." Nujood stood before the judge again, small, calm, and resolute. He asked, "Do you understand what divorce means?" "Yes," she said. "It means I will be free." The courtroom murmured. Some smiled in disbelief, others frowned. But for the first time, freedom had been defined by a child. The husband denied everything, claiming she had been disobedient. Her father, shamed by public attention, begged the court to dismiss the case. Yet Nujood did not flinch. Each question, each accusation she answered with the simplicity of someone who had already lived too much pain to fear more. "Why did you leave your husband's home?" "Because I was dying there." As days passed, the case grew into a symbol. Foreign reporters arrived, women's groups rallied, the courthouse steps filled with onlookers whispering her name. In private, the judge wrestled with the law and his conscience. He had daughters of his own. He knew the weight of tradition, but he also knew injustice when it stood before him, barefoot and bruised. Late one evening, he called Shada and said quietly, "Tell the girl to come tomorrow. I will decide." The next morning, Sana'a buzzed with rumors. Police guarded the gates. Clerks whispered prayers. When Nujood entered, the hall fell silent. The judge read the verdict slowly, his voice steady. The marriage of Nujood Ali is dissolved. She is granted divorce. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, a murmur spread. Disbelief, relief, awe. A 10-year-old had done what grown women rarely dared. That evening, Nujood stood on the courthouse steps beside Shada. The setting sun bathed the city in gold. Cameras clicked. Microphones crowded her small frame. A journalist asked, "What will you do now?" She smiled shyly. "Go to school." Simple words. Yet they sounded like a declaration of independence. The next morning, headlines carried her name before she even woke up. Child bride wins divorce. It was printed in Arabic, English, and French. It was whispered in tea houses, discussed in mosques, debated in ministries. In a single day, Nujood had become a symbol, though she didn't yet understand what symbols cost. Shada watched the tide of attention swell. Reporters camped outside her office, wanting every detail of the bravest girl in Yemen. Some asked kind questions. Others wanted drama. They spoke of injustice, of courage, of reform. But few asked how Nujood was sleeping at night. She wasn't sleeping at all. The house where Shada kept her for safety was quiet but foreign. The bed was soft, the sheets clean, yet her dreams still smelled of the mountains and of fear. Every night, she woke to phantom footsteps, the memory of a locked door, the echo of her husband's voice calling her name. Freedom, she was learning, doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes slowly, like dawn. A week after the verdict, international aid workers visited. One offered to buy her new clothes. Another promised to pay her school fees. Cameras followed, turning each gesture into a headline. When they handed her a pencil, she held it like something sacred. This is mine, she thought. No one can take this. But even then, she could sense the crowd around her wasn't just helping. They were watching. The world loved heroes, especially small ones who made adults uncomfortable. Shada shielded her as best she could. She spoke firmly to journalists. Remember, she is a child, not a cause. But Yemen's first child divorce case had cracked open a silence that could not be closed again. More girls came forward, frightened, hopeful, whispering their own stories. Each one had heard of Nujood. In villages miles away, mothers began to wonder if their daughters, too, could have a different fate. Change had started, uneven, fragile, but alive. At night, Shada would sit with Nujood by the balcony and talk softly. "Do you miss your family?" "I miss my mother," she said. "And your father?" A pause. "He should have protected me." Shada nodded. Sometimes parents are victims, too. They obey customs they don't believe in because they're afraid to stand alone. Nujood looked at her hands. Then maybe someone has to stop being afraid first. Months passed. The Ministry of Justice began drafting proposals to raise the legal age of marriage. Activists cited Nujood's name as evidence. She became the face of reform, small, smiling, holding a schoolbook. Yet, inside, she longed to disappear. Every interview repeated the same question. How does it feel to be famous? She didn't know how to answer. Fame didn't feel like freedom. It felt like standing under a spotlight when all she wanted was shade. When French journalist Delphine Minouy approached Shada about writing Nujood's story, Shada hesitated. But Delphine had a gentleness in her voice, a promise to protect her subject's dignity. Together, they began recording Nujood's memories, the mountain nights, the escape, the courthouse. Sometimes, during interviews, Nujood would stop mid-sentence and stare out the window. "Do you want to rest?" Delphine would ask. She would nod. "I just remember things I don't want to remember." Trauma, like shadow, never really leaves. It only changes shape. When the book I Am Nujood, Age 10 and Divorced was published, the world embraced her again. Oprah spoke her name. Time magazine listed her among the most influential people of the year. Letters arrived from every continent. Children wrote in colored ink, "You are my hero." Adults wrote, "You gave us hope." But between applause and translation rights, life in Yemen moved slower. Her family still struggled with money. Her father still made promises he couldn't keep. And Nujood still walked to school past neighbors who whispered, half admiration, half suspicion. One afternoon, she found her mother waiting outside the classroom. Shoya hugged her tightly, whispering, "Forgive me." Nujood wanted to. She tried. But forgiveness isn't a single word. It's a long road back through every moment of silence. Still, that night, she wrote her mother's name on the first page of her notebook, as if rewriting their story in ink might make it whole again. The following year, activists invited her to New York. Airplanes, skyscrapers, microphones. It was another world. She stood on a stage, a small figure under bright lights, telling strangers, "I am not the only one." Applause thundered, and for a moment she smiled. But backstage, away from cameras, she whispered to Shada, "Will people ever see me as just a girl again?" Shada took her hand. "Maybe not, but they will remember you." And sometimes remembering is the first step toward change. The day the book tour ended, the world's noise faded like a distant storm. For the first time in 2 years, Nujood was back home in Sana'a. No reporters, no microphones, no translators. Just the city's familiar hum and the quiet of ordinary life. She thought she would finally rest. But peace is never as simple as silence. At school, she sat by the window seat, tracing lines in her notebook. The other girls whispered, not unkindly, just uncertainly. There was admiration in their eyes, but also distance. She was famous, yes, but fame separated her as much as it celebrated her. One afternoon, a teacher smiled kindly and said, "You must be proud, Nujood. You taught the world something." She wanted to answer, "I didn't mean to teach the world. I just wanted to be free." But instead she nodded and looked down. Sometimes when people see courage, they forget it was born from fear. At home, her father had changed. Or maybe he had only grown more fragile beneath the surface. The brief attention, the donations, the interviews, had given him hope, then bitterness. He spent his days drifting between work that never lasted and talk of money that never came. One evening he said, "People think we are rich because of you. They ask for help." She said quietly, "But we have nothing." He looked at her as if she'd failed him twice. Once by escaping marriage, and again by not turning pain into profit. That night, she realized something painful. Bravery can liberate a soul, but still leave a family divided. Shada visited when she could. Her voice remained calm, steady, a lifeline of reason in a world of noise. "You have to study, Nujood," she said. "Education is the only divorce you'll ever need again." So she did. She read slowly, tracing every word with her finger, as if memorizing freedom one letter at a time. Her favorite subject was geography. Perhaps because maps showed places she could choose to go. Years passed quietly. Her face changed, her voice deepened. But every time she introduced herself, someone would ask, "Wait, are you that Nujood?" She would smile politely, but inside she wanted to shout, "I'm not just a story, I'm still becoming one." The cameras had long moved on to newer causes. The world had thanked her and left. Yet within her, the fire that made her walk to that courthouse still burned, smaller now, steadier, but unextinguished. In 2014, war broke out in Yemen. The skies thundered with jets, streets turned to rubble. Freedom, once a word she'd fought for, began to sound fragile again. She stopped attending school for a while, too dangerous to cross checkpoints. The city of her courage was now a battlefield. Sometimes, when the explosions echoed, she thought of that day in court, the calm voice of the judge, the strength in Shada's eyes. Even war couldn't erase that memory. It reminded her that courage isn't a single moment. It's a language you learn for life. Reporters found her again, now a young woman, quieter, more guarded. They asked, "Do you still believe your story changed Yemen?" She hesitated. "Change doesn't happen in a day," she said. "It happens in the days after the world stops watching." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years. She had once been a symbol. Now she was a survivor. And survival, she learned, was its own kind of bravery. In her late teens, she started writing small essays for a youth magazine. She wrote about girls who wanted to learn, about fathers who tried to do better, about how freedom was a habit you had to practice daily. She never signed them with her full name. Only N.A., maybe because she wanted people to read her words without attaching them to a memory of a child in torn sandals. One piece she wrote ended like this: "When you are a child who defies the world, everyone claps. But when you grow up, you have to find your voice again, not as a symbol, but as a person." That sentence went viral in Yemen's small digital circles. It reminded readers that even heroes outgrow their legends. Sometimes, late at night, she would open her old notebook, the one where she had written her mother's name, and trace it with her finger. Forgiveness, she realized, had finally arrived. Not as a grand moment, but as a quiet peace. She didn't hate her father anymore. She pitied him, trapped between shame and survival, in a world that never taught him how to choose love over fear. By her early 20s, Nujood had become a quiet shadow in her own legend. The war still rumbled over Yemen like an endless storm. Electricity came and went. Bread lines stretched for blocks. She spent her days teaching children in a makeshift classroom, behind a damaged school, 20 students, one chalkboard, and hope that refused to die. Each morning, she walked through the rubble carrying a bag of books tied with string. Some days, she wondered if any of them would make it to adulthood. But when they smiled, reciting letters in unison, the world felt briefly mended. A foreign organization offered her a scholarship to study abroad, a chance to escape the chaos, to begin again in a quiet country with steady lights and safe streets. Her friends urged her to go. Shada wrote a recommendation herself, but the decision haunted her. Leaving Yemen meant freedom, yet also abandoning the girls, whose lives still looked like her past. Staying meant danger, but also purpose. For weeks she prayed, thought, paced the rooftop at night. The sky was thick with smoke and stars, beauty and ruin intertwined. She remembered the first day she'd walked into that courthouse. No plan, no protection, just faith in the idea that someone had to act. Maybe this was the same moment again, only now. She was the one others looked to. One evening, she visited Shada in her law office. The walls were lined with files and faded newspaper clippings from Nujood's case. "You should go," Shada told her. "You can learn things there that will help you change things here." Nujood smiled sadly. "And who will change things while I'm gone?" Shada studied her for a moment, then said, "You've already done that once. Now, you have to decide what kind of woman you want to be next. A symbol or a builder." That night, she couldn't sleep. She opened her old notebook again, the one with her mother's name, and added another line beneath it. "Maybe the world doesn't need me to run again. Maybe it needs me to stay." The next morning, she declined the scholarship. Not because she didn't want a future, but because she wanted a future for others too. Weeks later, she started a small initiative with 3 friends called The Second Voice. Its goal was simple: teach girls their rights before marriage. Before any man could decide for them, they met in community centers, mosques, and once even under a tree when the building was bombed the night before. Word spread. Mothers brought daughters, fathers listened from doorways. Change moved quietly, like water through cracks in stone. One afternoon, a girl of about 12 stayed after class. She fidgeted with her scarf and whispered, "My family says I'm to be married next month." Nujood felt the old chill rise in her spine. "What do you want?" "I want to finish school." Nujood nodded. "Then you must say so. Say it to someone who can help. Say it even if your voice shakes." The girl hesitated. "What if they don't listen?" "Then come back tomorrow," Nujood said. "I'll go with you." And she did. 2 weeks later, that child's marriage was postponed. Small victories are the seeds of revolutions. At night, Nujood sometimes sat on her roof again, listening to the city's uneven heartbeat. The air was still thick with dust, but she felt lighter. She thought of her younger self, the girl who had once walked alone to a courthouse, with nothing but fear and determination. Now she walked with others, and she realized something quiet and profound. Courage isn't measured by how loudly you fight, but by how steadily you stay. A foreign documentary crew arrived to film an update on her life. The director asked, "What made you stay here when you could have left?" She answered simply, "Because I know what it's like to be a girl with no one to speak for her. And now, I can speak." He paused his camera. "Do you believe you were chosen for this?" She smiled. "No, I believe I was left with it, and that's enough." Her organization grew. By her mid-20s, she had helped dozens of girls avoid child marriage, some of whom now worked beside her. They called her Ustada Nujood, Teacher Nujood. It sounded strange at first, like a name that belonged to someone wiser. But each time a child smiled in class, the title felt earned. One day after a session, a foreign diplomat asked to meet her. He told her that her case had inspired legislation in other countries to raise the marriage age. She listened quietly and said, "I hope they remember the girls who don't make it to the courthouse." He replied, "You changed the world." She smiled. "No, the world changed me. I just decided to listen." That night, she wrote in her notebook again, "I once asked for a divorce. Now I ask for a future." The pages were full of names, girls she'd met, families she'd helped, stories unfinished. Each one was a testament to how far a single no could travel across time. It began with an envelope slipped under the door of the small office she shared with her team. Inside was a letter written in careful Arabic. "Your courage changed the lives of many. I don't wish to borrow it, only to understand it. No signature, just a first name, Yahya." At first, she thought it was another journalist or donor. But the next week, another letter arrived, this time with a pressed wildflower inside. "You once walked to a courthouse alone. I only wish to walk beside someone brave." She laughed when she read it, unsure whether to feel flattered or afraid. The memory of her childhood marriage still lived in her bones. A warning, a scar, that whispered caution whenever affection approached. But the handwriting was gentle, the words measured. He mentioned he was a teacher volunteering in the same education network. They met 2 weeks later in a community meeting about literacy programs. Yahya was quiet, mid-20s, eyes full of patience. When he spoke, his sentences seemed to weigh both thought and respect. After the meeting, he said softly, "You don't have to answer my letters. I just wanted you to know that not every man in this country wants silence from a woman." It was a simple statement, but it unsettled her more than any proposal could. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the city flicker through the war-torn dark. Was it possible to trust again? Could love exist without control? Could she walk towards someone without running from herself? She had told so many girls that courage meant saying no. Maybe, she thought. Sometimes courage also means daring to say maybe. Over the next months, Yahya continued to help with her programs. He never pushed, never demanded attention. When her students needed supplies, he arrived quietly with notebooks. When bombings shook the district, he checked on every volunteer before himself. Gradually, friendship replaced fear. They talked about books, teaching, and what Yemen might become after the war. He once said, "You know, the world calls you brave. But I think your real bravery is still happening, every time you choose to believe in tomorrow." She didn't answer, but the words stayed with her like a lantern in the dark. Then, one afternoon, he asked the question directly but without ceremony. "If I spoke to your family, for your hand, would you allow it?" Her breath caught. The room seemed to shrink to the sound of her heartbeat. She looked at him and saw no threat, no shadow of ownership, only an invitation. Yet memory is a stubborn ghost. It showed her the wedding veil she never wanted, the locked door, the silence after the screams. She stood up. "I can't. I don't know how to be someone's wife." He nodded slowly. "Then be yourself." "If that's not enough, I'm not worthy anyway." For days, she avoided him. Old fears crawled back. The idea that marriage meant losing control, that love demanded surrender. But teaching the younger girls reminded her of her own lessons. Freedom isn't about running away, she had told them once. It's about choosing where you stand. Was she now failing her own words? She sought Shada's counsel. The lawyer listened silently, then said, "You've lived through the worst form of marriage. Maybe it's time to show the world what the right kind can look like." "Do you think I can?" Nujood asked. Shada smiled. "If anyone can redefine it, it's you." The next week, she met Yahya again on the same rooftop, where her students sometimes read by lantern light. "I'm not ready for marriage," she began, "but I'm ready to stop being afraid of it." He smiled. "Then let's begin there." No contracts, no promises. Just patience. They talked for hours until dawn. The city was quiet, almost peaceful. It wasn't romance as the world imagined it. It was two survivors comparing scars and still daring to dream. Months later, when they did marry, simply quietly without spectacle, the ceremony was held in the same courthouse where she had once asked for a divorce. The irony was not lost on her. The judge who officiated recognized her name and paused before reading the vows. "Life has a way of completing its circles," he said gently. And as she signed the papers, Nujood realized that this time, the ink did not chain her. It freed her. Her marriage became its own lesson, a public whisper that not all unions destroy, that healing sometimes comes from facing the same door you once escaped. She continued her advocacy work, now with Yahya at her side. Together they expanded the second voice into rural areas, reaching families who had never heard a girl speak about her own rights before. Whenever she introduced herself, she still said, "I'm Nujood Ali." But now when people asked, "Which Nujood?" she smiled and answered, "The one who stayed." The first explosion rattled the glass before dawn. By the time the second one came, the entire city was awake. Sirens wailed, children cried, and smoke rolled across Sana'a like a living shadow. Nujood clutched her phone, dialing names that didn't answer. Yahya was already at the window, scanning the horizon where flames bloomed behind the hills. "The school," he said, grabbing his jacket. She followed without hesitation. Habit had taught her that when the world collapses, teachers run toward their students, not away. The streets were chaos, cars abandoned, people shouting prayers, the smell of burning fuel heavy in the air. When they reached the small classroom they'd built from concrete and tarps, the roof was half gone, but the children were alive, huddled in the corner. "It's all right," she whispered, crouching beside them. "We're together. That means we're safe." Her voice shook. But sometimes, courage is simply the tone you use when others are listening. For the next week, Sana'a became a map of fear and survival. Airstrikes by day, silence by night. Water lines broke, markets closed. Hope thinned like rationed bread. Yahya turned the school basement into a shelter. Nujood taught lessons by candlelight. Letters, songs, and stories that reminded children the world still had words in it. Once, a boy asked, "Teacher, why are they fighting?" She paused. "Because some people forget that power without kindness destroys both." The boy frowned. "Will they remember?" She smiled softly. "One day, maybe because you'll remind them." The stars were faint through smoke but still visible. "I used to think my story ended in the courthouse," she said one evening. Yahya looked at her. "And now?" "Now I think it never really ends. It just keeps changing its name." He nodded. "That's how legacies work. They don't belong to one moment. They live in what you keep doing when no one's watching." Weeks later, an airstrike hit a nearby neighborhood where many of her students lived. The next morning, half the seats in class were empty. She tried to teach, but her voice cracked halfway through a poem about courage. She turned to the chalkboard, hiding tears that refused to wait. One girl stood up quietly, walked to the board, and finished the poem herself. When she sat back down, she said, "You told us courage doesn't leave. It moves." In that instant, Nujood felt the circle of her life tighten. Teacher and student exchanging faith in humanity, the way others exchange air. Aid agencies began evacuating staff. Shada called from a safer region, urging her to leave. "You've done enough, Nujood. Let others take it from here." But she couldn't. She looked at the children sleeping on the floor, the shelves of books rescued from rubble. "I once walked to freedom alone," she told Yahya. "Now I'll stand for it with them." He didn't argue. He only said, "Then we'll stand together." Months blurred into seasons. Their small program became part school, part orphanage, part dream. Whenever they ran out of food, neighbors shared what little they had. Whenever despair crept in, someone would remind them, "This place was started by a girl who once changed the law. If she could do that, we can survive this." Sometimes she wondered if that legend helped them or trapped her. But when she saw a child laugh again, she decided legends are only prisons if you stop living beyond them. In 2022, when the fighting eased temporarily, an international documentary crew visited the shelter. They filmed the children reading, the cracked walls, the faces of teachers who hadn't been paid in months. One journalist asked her, "After everything, do you still believe in hope?" She thought for a long time before answering. "I believe in memory," she said finally. "Hope is what memory turns into when you refuse to forget what matters." When the documentary aired, donations poured in. Books, supplies, food. But what moved her most was a letter from a girl in another country. "I'm 12. My parents want me to leave school. I showed them your video. Now they changed their mind." Nujood folded the letter carefully and kept it in her notebook beside her mother's name. It reminded her that every voice she'd raised had reached further than the sound of war. One evening, as she and Yahya repaired a wall, he said quietly, "Do you ever regret staying?" She looked at him, the man who had never tried to silence her, the life she had built from ashes, and answered, "No, because staying turned fear into purpose." He smiled. "And purpose into peace." She laughed softly. "Not yet. But maybe someday." That night, under the bruised sky of Sana'a, she wrote one last line in her notebook. "The day I walked to the courthouse, I thought I was saving one life, my own. Now I know courage never saves just one person." It was a gray morning when the letter arrived. The government seal on the envelope was faded, but the handwriting inside was clear and official. "Ms. Nujood Ali is hereby invited to speak before the National Council on the proposed child marriage reform bill." She read it twice, then a third time. The place, Sana'a Central Courthouse. The same hall where she had once stood barefoot, trembling, and begged to be free. The years folded back in an instant. She still remembered the smell of that courtroom. Dust, old paper, men's cologne. The echo of laughter when a little girl had said she wanted a divorce. The sound of a pen signing her childhood back to her. Now, 2 decades later, she was being asked to return. Not as a victim, but as a witness to history. When she showed Yahya the letter, he smiled. "You see? Life brings us back to where we began, just to see if we've truly changed." She ran her fingers over the paper. "Do you think they'll listen?" He looked at her gently. "They listened once, didn't they? Even when you were 10. She nodded slowly. "Then I'll go. But this time, I'll speak for those who can't make it to the courthouse." The drive to the capital was long and slow. War had left the roads broken, patched with gravel and memory. From the window, she saw villages where girls her age would once have been married. Now many were in school. Some had become teachers. But not all. Change, she thought, never walks in a straight line. It limps, falls, and stands again. When she reached the courthouse, her chest tightened. The steps were the same, the doors still heavy, only she had changed. Cameras lined the hallway as she entered. Reporters from around the world, eager to capture the symmetry of a story coming full circle. "Ms. Ali, how does it feel to be back?" one shouted. She paused. "It feels like meeting the child I used to be, and realizing she never left." Inside, the chamber buzzed with debate. Some delegates argued tradition, others demanded progress. When the chairman called her name, the room quieted. She walked to the podium, not fast, not slow, just steady. She took a breath. 20 years ago, she began, I stood in this courthouse, asking for something no child should have to ask for, a divorce. Today, I stand here asking for something every child deserves, a childhood. Murmurs rippled through the room. She continued, voice calm but firm. When I was 10, you told me the law had no rule for my case. You said I was too young to decide my own life. But if I was old enough to be married, I was old enough to speak. A pause. Silence thickened. I'm not here to argue against our culture, she said softly. I'm here to remind you what it was meant to protect. Families, compassion, dignity. When we force girls into marriage, we're not preserving tradition, we're breaking it. As she spoke, she noticed an older man in the front row, a face lined with time but hauntingly familiar. Her father. She hadn't seen him in years. He sat still, eyes lowered, hands trembling in his lap. Her voice faltered for a second, then steadied. Some of us were betrayed not by strangers, but by love that didn't know better, she said, glancing at him. Forgiveness, she continued, isn't weakness. It's how we teach the next generation what strength truly looks like. A hush spread across the room. Even the translators stopped typing. When she finished, the hall erupted into quiet applause. Not thunderous, but deep, respectful. The chairman nodded. Your words will be recorded in the final session. Thank you, Ms. Ali. As she stepped down, her father stood slowly. Their eyes met. The years of anger, guilt, distance, all condensed into one fragile moment. He whispered, I'm sorry. She nodded once, tears slipping silently down her face. Me too, she said. Outside, the air was cool. Reporters followed, asking what she hoped would happen next. She said simply, I hope no girl will ever have to come here for the reason I did. The cameras clicked. But for her, the true image was invisible. A little girl in a dusty veil, walking barefoot toward freedom. That night back home, she and Yahya sat by the window again. He poured her tea and asked, Do you think they'll pass the law? She smiled faintly. I don't know. But even if they don't, they've heard us. And sometimes that's how real change begins. As a whisper. She looked up at the sky, now clearer than she'd seen in years. Do you ever think God lets us relive our hardest moments, just to see what we've learned? Yahya nodded. I think he lets us return to them, so we can leave differently. She smiled. Then this time, I'm leaving with peace. It happened quietly, the way life's greatest turns often do, without fanfare, without warning, just an ordinary day that refused to stay ordinary. The bombing that week had struck a residential area near the edge of Sana'a. When the smoke cleared, volunteers from the Second Voice went to distribute food and blankets. Among the crowd of displaced families, Nujood noticed a small girl sitting alone beside the rubble, clutching a torn backpack. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her face was streaked with ash, her eyes wide but dry, the kind of stillness that comes after too many shocks. Nujood crouched beside her. What's your name, sweetheart? The girl hesitated, then whispered, Amira. Where are your parents? The child looked away. Gone. The single word carried a lifetime. That evening, Nujood brought Amira to the shelter. The other children offered her food, but she only stared at the floor. When Nujood tucked her into bed, Amira whispered, If I sleep, will they find me? Her voice trembled the way Nujood's once had. Nujood brushed the girl's hair gently. You're safe here. No one will take you away. Amira nodded, but kept her eyes open all night. Days turned into weeks. Amira spoke little, smiled less, but she followed Nujood everywhere. To the classroom, the kitchen, even meetings with donors. Sometimes Nujood caught her copying the way she folded papers or poured tea, as if trying to borrow a sense of order from the chaos. Yahya noticed it first. She looks at you the way the others used to look at Shada, he said one evening. Nujood smiled softly. Maybe she sees what I once saw, someone who stayed. One afternoon, while organizing lessons, she heard laughter from the courtyard. Amira was drawing on the ground with chalk, houses, clouds, a small figure holding a book. What are you drawing? Nujood asked. Amira pointed at the figure. That's you. And who's that? She pointed at a smaller one beside it. That's me, when I grow up. Nujood felt something shift inside her, a warmth she hadn't known in years. She realized she had been teaching resilience, but now she was witnessing it reborn. Later that week, a social worker arrived with news. Amira's relatives had been found, distant cousins in another province, poor but alive. They wanted to take her. Nujood's heart tightened. Will she be safe there? The social worker hesitated. They're struggling, but by law, she belongs with family. That night, Nujood couldn't sleep. She remembered her own childhood, how belonging had been used to trap her. Was she repeating the same logic now, protecting by holding on? At dawn, she sat by Amira's bed. The girl stirred. Are we leaving? Nujood nodded slowly. You'll live with your family again. Amira's eyes filled. Can't I stay with you? Nujood swallowed hard. I'll visit you. I promise. The lie burned even as she said it, because promises in war are fragile things. They traveled together to the province. The village was dusty, the house small but standing. A woman greeted them with cautious relief. Amira clung to Nujood's scarf. "Don't go," she whispered. Nujood knelt and held her tightly. "You're stronger than you think, Amira. You already know how to be brave. You showed me." Then she pressed a small notebook into her hand, the same one that once carried her mother's name. "Keep this," she said. "Write in it whenever you're scared. Words will keep you safe." The ride back to Sana'a was silent. Yahya drove, glancing at her now and then. "You did the right thing," he said. She nodded, but her voice was hollow. "Then why does it hurt so much?" "Because letting go," he said gently, "is another kind of courage." Weeks passed. Letters began arriving again, small envelopes with uneven handwriting. "Dear teacher, today I helped a girl in my class read. I told her she can be anything. Is that true?" Nujood smiled through tears. She replied, "Yes, Amira. Anything and everything." More letters came, drawings of books, a sun, and 2 stick figures holding hands. Each one healed a part of her she didn't know was still broken. Months later, at an event for educators, a journalist asked her, "What's your proudest moment?" She thought for a while before answering, "Not when I won my case. Not when the book was published. My proudest moment was watching a little girl draw herself into a future." That evening, she placed Amira's latest drawing beside her desk, a picture of 2 houses connected by a road. Beneath it, the girl had written in careful script, "Home is not where you're born. It's where someone teaches you to stay brave." Nujood closed her eyes. For the first time, she understood that motherhood was not always about giving birth. Sometimes it was about giving meaning. The call came on a quiet night in early spring. The war had calmed, though the city still wore its scars. Buildings half standing, hearts half healed. The voice on the phone was familiar, older, and weighted with nostalgia. "Ms. Ali," said the man softly, "this is Judge Abdul Rahman Al-Ahdal. The court is organizing a commemoration for the 20th anniversary of your case. We would be honored if you'd attend." For a long moment, she said nothing. The judge. The same man who had first listened when no one else did. The circle was calling her home. The day of the event, Sana'a wore a calm kind of chaos. The courthouse steps were crowded again. Journalists, students, women with banners. But this time, there were also little girls, holding notebooks and pens instead of wedding veils. Inside, the hall had been repainted, the walls brighter, yet the smell of dust and history remained the same. At the front sat the judge, older now, his beard white, his eyes kind. He greeted her with a smile that trembled slightly. "When you came here 20 years ago, I didn't know what to do. The law failed you, but your courage taught us what justice could become." She bowed her head. "You gave me a voice. I only learned how to use it later." When she stepped to the podium, the hall fell silent. Cameras turned, pens hovered. For a brief moment, she felt again like that 10-year-old girl, frightened, barefoot, unseen. Then she lifted her head and began. "I once thought justice was something handed down by others," she said. "But I've learned it's something we must live every day, in how we treat our children, in how we choose mercy over pride." Her voice grew steadier. "When I walked into this building at 10 years old, I didn't come to change laws. I came to stop pain. But pain, when faced with courage, has a way of turning into purpose." She paused, scanning the room. In the second row sat Amira, now 16, smiling shyly. "She was only a child when war took everything," Nujood continued. "Today, she's one of the top students in her class. That's what courage looks like when it grows up." Applause rippled softly through the hall. She looked upward briefly, as if to the ceiling, but her tone became almost a whisper. "There were times I asked why God chose me for this path. I used to think it was punishment, but now I see it was preparation. He never gave me ease, he gave me strength." A hush deepened, reverent but not solemn. Every person carries a story, but stories are not meant to be carried forever. They are meant to be passed on. If mine has reached you today, let it remind you. When life breaks you, it might be building something through you. Afterward, the judge presented her with a small plaque. It read simply, "For courage in pursuit of justice." She smiled, remembering the child who once pursued it without even knowing its name. As she stepped outside, the afternoon sun touched the marble steps. Reporters waited again. But this time, she wasn't running from them. They asked what message she wanted to give the world. She said quietly, "Teach your daughters to dream and your sons to listen. The rest will follow." That evening, she returned home to Yahya and Amira. They sat together on the rooftop, the city stretching beneath them, quiet but alive. Yahya poured tea, the smell of mint drifting in the cool air. "You've closed the circle," he said. She smiled. "Maybe circles never close. Maybe they keep widening until everyone fits inside." Amira handed her a small wrapped gift. Inside was a new notebook. On the first page, the girl had written, "For everything you taught me, I will teach someone else." Nujood's eyes glistened. She looked at the notebook, then at the sky. Above the smoke-stained city, the stars were visible again, faint, stubborn, shining anyway. She thought of all the people who had walked with her. Shada, the judge, her mother, the children, the countless women whose names would never make the news. She realized that true change doesn't happen in speeches or books. It happens in hearts that quietly decide to stay kind. And in that moment, she understood her life's message. Simple, unadorned, but eternal. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep walking, even when the road once hurt you. The night deepened. She leaned back, her hand resting over the old plaque on the table, whispering as if to herself, "Every story begins in silence. But the miracle is not that it's heard, it's that someone dared to speak." So tonight, if you're listening by our fireside, remember her walk. The one that began with trembling feet and ended with steady purpose. She was only 10, but she taught the world something ageless. That one small voice can reorder a nation's conscience. And that faith, in justice, in goodness, in God's timing, never echoes in vain. Thank you for being part of our little circle tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.